Okay, we're going to hit some of the material from chapter 5 and some material that I want to add that's not quite covered in the chapter. We have some learning objectives all related to basically the entrepreneurial mindset, opportunity recognition, and idea generation that may help your team as you go through your generation process. So we'll start with a notable quote from Milton, the author of The Complete Entrepreneur, who basically says that entrepreneurs have a knack for looking at the usual and seeing the unusual, looking at the ordinary and seeing the extraordinary. Consequently, they spot opportunities and turn commonplace into the unique and unexpected. This, however, is not an inborn trait. It's a skill you learn, just like you can learn to throw a ball. No one's born throwing it. Some throw it better than others, but whether or not you learn is the important part. And learning to look at things from a slightly different point of view is an important property for you as a budding entrepreneur. So let's start with, what is an opportunity? So opportunities have to have the capacity to generate value. Okay, it could be economic value, which is what many people think of when they think entrepreneurial, but it could also be a social value, if you're a social entrepreneur, or an environmental value. And it can even be a value in terms of your personal satisfaction. Now, to be a sustainable business, it's going to have to generate some economic value for someone, because that's the only way it stays in business. But personal satisfaction and enjoying your job is an important part of it. And so you can find an opportunity that generates enough along multiple dimensions to make things viable. In the end, with an analysis, you can sort of see that this needs to be new or unique in some important dimension. It doesn't have to be absolutely unique. It doesn't have to be completely new, but it has to be at least locally unique. Otherwise, you're competing with something that's already there. So you have to find some dimension, some unique selling point that we'll be able to compete on later. So it's got to have both value and some level of uniqueness that you're going to have to look at. There are really two primary ways the book talks about, and in general, that people talk about opportunities. The first is the finding approach. And this assumes that the opportunities exist independent of the entrepreneurs and they're waiting to be found. And this is definitely a commonplace occurrence. You'll find them. These two are not mutually exclusive. They both exist at the same time. So the second way is the building approach. This concept assumes that these types of opportunities do not exist independent of the entrepreneurs, but are instead a product of the mind. So this is what we call creating new markets or building new markets. And these are things that no one had thought of before they were invented, and then they turn into whole markets. So you can imagine products in both spaces. Stop a second and think. Can you identify some examples of what would be something from the finding approach and something that would be from the building approach? And of course, they don't even have to be distinctly either. It could be a little bit of both. When the iPod first came out, it was nowhere near the first MP3 player. So that was not a finding an opportunity, but it was a building an opportunity, because the iPod came out with a technological coupling of it to its iTunes music store and a couple other small technological advances that really made it go forward. What's an example of a finding approach? Can you think of any? Well, if we think about the origins, very often finding opportunities occur because of changes in technologies, markets, consumer tastes, government, regulations. Any of those things can produce a new opportunity. Lots of the finding opportunities tend not to be the super really big names, but they're out there finding them. And then building opportunities are really building on your prior knowledge and experience. So you can see them sort of how they come up in both of those. In my introduction, I talked about some of the companies I was involved with. Can you identify one of those as a finding approach? So if you think back to the way I looked at it, Guardian Solutions, which was the surveillance company, was started right after 9/11. That was a finding approach. The entrepreneur who founded the company, the CEO, identified this change in the space and said there's going to be markets here, there's going to be opportunities, and then he spent a little bit of time looking for what opportunities were the biggest, and sort of market analysis we'll talk about later, and then eventually decided on the video surveillance space that he brought me in to help build, right? So I had been building surveillance stuff, but I hadn't recognized the market opportunity. So you got to put the two together. And this idea of searching and scanning the environment is an important part of the finding opportunities. Securix, which was my last company, was really a building opportunity. Based on my knowledge and experience, I identified a problem. I spent some time trying to learn how to solve that problem, And once I had a technological solution, I started out trying to make that happen. So there was a little bit about building networks because I had to work with different people to understand the privacy concerns and how big those things were, and then to find a technological solution, and then actually to build the network to make it happen. So in one case, in finding opportunities, you have to be alert to the environment. In the other case, you have to take action, continuously learning and iterations to build things better. Now, it turns out you still, when you're building opportunities, it's only opportunity if it's going to build value and better in some dimension. So you got to find that, which is a little bit of finding that happens along the way. Finding opportunities are often, in terms of their decisions, viewed as risky because you're not sure the opportunity is real. In building opportunities, it's perceived as uncertain. When I started Securix, I wasn't sure I could make the technology work well enough to be competitive and commercializable, right? You know you have an idea, that doesn't mean the idea will actually work. And so they have two different kinds of uncertainty you have to put together. So again, building opportunity, you're building on the prior knowledge of your team and sort of recognition of patterns that can be going out, and you gotta find them. Now, it's also important when I say this, it doesn't have to be your personal prior knowledge. You can actually hire the prior knowledge. So after my partner at Guardian Solutions, right, identified the opportunity. So he found the opportunity, but he didn't find the full opportunity because his original solution was going to be cable, just like everyone else who was going to try and compete in the space using the standard technology. In a different way, we built a new technology that was wireless and allowed us to compete very effectively in facilities that other people just couldn't put an effective bid in because they had to go with wired solutions. So you can put things together. He hired my knowledge to make that part work. In finding, discovering opportunities, it really comes down to a combination of things. Active search and alertness. Once you've started, you're aware of what's going on, then you can start doing an active search, or you can always be out there searching. There's a bunch of entrepreneurs who sort of always are out networking, looking for the opportunities, looking for what's going on. And we'll talk a little bit more about those. It's important, and the book talks a little bit about the distinction between idea generation, creativity, and opportunity recognition. Idea generation is easy. You produce new ideas for something new, right? Ideas are a dime a dozen. You've heard the phrase, it's cliche, but it's also very true. Literally, I work with organizations where they get thousands and thousands of ideas. Now, the price has gone up a little bit. They're about $25 a dozen now, but you know, they don't pay much for ideas. They pay for things that actually solve problems. Creativity, although the book puts it in between, right? To me, creativity is being creative. It may or may not be something that is potentially useful. It's sort of interesting because lots of people look at creativity much more on the art and the artistic side, which means it may or may not be useful at all. So to me, creativity has got a slightly different definition than what the book has. Opportunity recognition is the recognition that ideas are not only potentially new and useful, but also have the potential to generate economic value. To see how something can make money, or how something can provide value at a social level or an environmental level, that's the opportunity recognition. So it's a multidimensional thing, which hopefully you'll be getting through your education in the BI. And as you go through that process, these become more and more important in your new venture process as you get to this higher level. So I actually said before there were two ways, and now I'm going to break it down and really say there's three ways to identify an opportunity. When I was looking at the before, I was talking about sort of finding and building. So in each case, there can be a relationship to two parts to it. So you might identify a part of the opportunity, but then you also have to find whether or not it produces value. So the first of these is observing trends. There are lots of trends. 9/11 was a disruptive, instantaneous change in trends. The increase in security awareness after 9/11. But there's other trends. Can you think of any going on in your life, going on in the country? So right now we have these trends related to, say, pandemics. We have trends related to the aging of our population and the growth of the young millennial generation is becoming a significant buying power. Lots of different directions. All of those are trends. Observing a trend and figuring out where you want to go. Another way, which is related to trends, because trends just tell you, here's a growing market, right? That gives you an opportunity. But what problem are you going to solve? So after you've identified the direction, you've observed the trend to find it, you now have to go solve a problem. And it turns out that that could be building an approach that is a solution that no one's ever thought of, or you might find a way to take an existing problem, an existing solution, and adapt it to a problem to make the solution more efficient. And we'll go through you'll see multiple examples throughout the semester where you're going to take an idea that's been used in some other field and apply it in a new domain, or where you take something that's actually really old and bring it back again. So that can be another example of solving a problem. And then finally, after you've done your observing of the trends and you've tried to figure out what problem it is you're trying to solve, you also have to find a gap in the marketplace. You have to find that this is not a solution that's already out there. Lots of ideas die, especially in the ENTP1000, because people haven't done their homework and this product already exists. I've been to plenty of business plan competitions and as well as seeing lots of things in this type of classes where people haven't done the basic searches to find out what's going on. And we'll actually do a little bit of Google Wars later this semester just so you can sort of see a little bit for ourselves as we go through this. Knowing what the right terms are to search for makes it very hard. And lots of people look at the world through their lens and they don't see the alternative solutions and the alternative terms that products already exist with. And so you have to go through that. And I've presented these here as an order. It turns out you can actually do this other ways around. You can first observe a gap in the marketplace because you want something and you can't find it. I'm sure you've all seen examples of this on Shark Tank and whatever, where it's like, I needed this and I couldn't find the product. So I observed that this is a trend that's growing, so it's not just a one-off thing, and then I solve the problem by doing something, right? You can do these in almost any order, but really all three of these are important parts of identifying an opportunity. So if we look at the kinds of changes that encourage the entrepreneurial discovery for opportunity identification, right? Anytime there's a big enough change, and the more rapid the change, the more disruptive the change, the easier it is often for you to find an entrepreneurial opportunity to discover something new. Because the bigger the change, the less anticipated it was by all the competition, it means you're starting out closer to where everyone else is. Things like the internet, which happened back in the 80s, late 80s, early 90s, right? It's transformed all kinds of things in ways that most of you can't even think about because you grew up with it. But I still can remember times when there was no internet, where doing research meant going to the library and looking through books and journals, where TV was delivered over the air, right? Now we've gone through that to cable, to now lots of you only watch content through the internet. But those are, I mean, that's a major, major change. Those happen once in a lifetime or two. But lots of smaller things happen. Political changes, social changes, environmental changes, demographic changes, any of these kinds of changes. And some of them are slow moving. Things like the use of the Spanish language, the graying of our population. That is a slow moving space. Obviously we age at a constant rate. But the changing of how many old people versus young people, and then the new younger generation with a gap in the middle, those kinds of changes are slow, but that doesn't mean they're not important in terms of entrepreneurial activity. So once you identify a change, then you can dig into that area to try and get a little bit more understanding of what's going to happen next. So as just one example, right, if we look at some of these trends, right, so economic forces, the state of the economy, levels of disposable income and consumer spending, right? This produces gaps in opportunities. The shift as we had these economic forces with lots of people losing their jobs, all of a sudden there was more shift towards delivery jobs because people wanted to have things delivered. Not necessarily a major opportunity because it's short-lived, but there's an interesting question of how many people will be going back. Lots of companies will be doing more telework and remote working, although there's always the risk that if the work can be done remotely, why are you paying somebody expensive in the United States and not paying somebody in India who can do it remotely at a cheaper wage? So those sort of social forces can be both good and bad, right? All of a sudden you can say, we want to pay people more. We want to have a higher minimum wage, which can be good for business. But it can also mean new opportunities because as they raise minimum wage, things like the people who used to work at McDonald's taking your order at the drive-thru are now often halfway around the world. The person speaking to you on the other side of that microphone can be in India receiving your order and then putting it back in the computer and it shows up back at the checkout counter, right? So all kinds of odd opportunities show up as you go through these things, and technological advances are often a part of that. Things that didn't used to exist in terms of digital advertising are now the biggest businesses in our country for some of them. And political and regulatory change as things happen. So we have a regulatory change that encourages solar. All of a sudden there's a whole bunch more solar companies being built. Regulatory changes that change medical or other regulated organizations. have a significant change, and all of them produce businesses that can be out there. You have to be looking for them at the right time. You have to have the right solutions as you move forward. But anytime you see a disruptive change, it might be a time to put on your entrepreneurial thinking hat. My hope is by the end of this class that not that all of you will have done a startup by the time you're done this class or even done your undergraduate studies. My hope is that we're laying the foundation for you to have this entrepreneurial mindset, and one day when you see the right opportunity, you will say, I now know what to do. I've recognized this opportunity. I will step out and do it. So LotSpot, which I also mentioned earlier this year, right, is a company that recognized the problem of parking. Now, they really wanted to solve the student parking problem, and they have a system that was being tested here on campus for parking. Not a big problem this semester, so you probably won't be seeing it, but campus was looking at it to make parking more efficient. This problem came because of the continued growth of the university. And importantly, it wasn't just that it was a problem for them. They also recognized the problem was going to get worse because the student population was going to grow and parking spaces were actually going to shrink as campus builds other buildings and parking lots disappear. What is now the Osborne building that our class actually sits in was at one point in time part of a parking area. The engineering parking lot was bigger. Now it's Osborne Hall. And campuses routinely converted things as they needed to move forward. So with respect to discovering things, there are two primary ways that I like to think of making discoveries. The first is scientific. When something happens, a physical or technological change happens, you can see that as the beginning of something new. So my efforts in the company Remote Reality came out of this observation that, again, my colleague Sri Nair had, that you could do this, but I saw a very different potential, which is part of why they brought me into the company, because they were looking at it from using still photographs and then eventually videos, and they thought this would be great for the real estate market, and I helped on that as well, but I saw the potential for military applications where things like a periscope, you simply can't afford to have a bunch of cameras. I can do real estate by taking lots of photos of a house and get a pretty good feel for it without the need for this 360. But for a drone that can carry only one camera, or a small mobile robot, or military things like a periscope, I saw tremendous opportunities. And so I joined the company seeing that scientific thing that was going to be enabled by that and make it happen. Securix, my last company, was also a technological thing where I finally found a breakthrough that I thought could change how privacy biometrics were done. And the circumstantial things where you observe circumstances. And circumstantial discovery, and I sort of draw a slight distinction here from what the book talks about, this really is circumstances that change more often radically. It's not quite as much of a trend, but as opposed to a radical kinds of things. So Guardian Solutions was a circumstantial discovery, followed by some technological advances to make it happen. So there are lots of different ways that entrepreneurs can gain and use the information for discovery. So you have to be a little careful. There's not a one-size-fits-all. There's not a single formula to go through here. Instead, you want to recognize that you can build on your personal experiences. Always a really good place to start. You or someone on your team has personal experiences. But that's not really enough to decide that it's from a discovery point of view, that's a sort of what you might call a spark of an idea. You got to work that out. So your position in social networks, who you know, how you can get there, that might get you more information. Often there's also a function of the nature of the search process that a person uses. This is often the distinction between companies that do very well and companies that fail. The more you search and figure out where is the niche, where is the real opportunity and the differentiation, the more effective you can be at doing this. And we'll push you on this topic throughout the semester. Another important thing is the individual's ability to focus on the opportunities. This is one of my personal failings. I don't focus for long periods of time on one thing very well. I'm very multitasking oriented. So while I had those 3 startup companies involvements and some other things along the side, I've also always been a professor since 1986 at various universities. So I've had 1 or 2 full-time jobs, depending on how you want to look at my entrepreneurial thing. When my last company worked, we were looking at taking some VC funds. The VCs were pretty clear. They wanted me to cut back or leave the university, and they wanted my partner to step down so that there was only one of us, and that's just not what I wanted to do. So I've had to have that ability I lack the ability to focus on just one thing, which sometimes has limited my upside opportunities. But again, my goals weren't values just financially, but also personal satisfaction goals, which have been very high in my entrepreneurial side. And then there's also, the person's intelligence. whether or not they can see or just figure out how to make things work. And when I say a person or personal here, right, again, it's members of your team. It doesn't have to be you as the individual. You can be part of a team that drives one aspect and somebody else is driving another. So the book talks a little bit about the SEEK model, and I'll briefly go over this. One of the things I wanted to point out is, to me, SEEK is really an application of self-efficacy-based self-improvement. The book talks about it as though it's a theory. It's really underlyingly tied to self-efficacy. And so it has a strong psychological underpinnings that the book doesn't really talk about. But the SEEK model is based on this idea of securing, expanding, composing, and challenging as a way of improving your opportunity recognition. So securing is really about being consciously aware of possibilities, focusing on capturing ideas, and recording the ideas for later use. My guess is most of you in this class have had something where you had an idea, you saw something and thought, that would make a great product or a great service or whatever. Or you identified a problem. It's like, oh, if only there was something to do this. And then a couple years later, that was there, right? Being aware that you had this idea is a good sign that you really have the entrepreneurial opportunity recognition engine running. You're recognizing them, you're just not going to the next step. But if you've never seen one of those, if you've never seen something where you said earlier, before it came out as a product, right, this could make a really good idea, then you've got to work on trying to do that. And even if right now you don't have the time or the money to ever generate a business, and that's okay, work on your opportunity recognition. Make a little notebook or a file you keep on your phone with ideas. And every time you see an idea, you might say, wow, here's an idea. And in my phone, I do this all the time. I recognize ideas. That doesn't mean they all turn into businesses. In fact, most of them don't. But you refine the process. And every time you do that, you become better at recognizing them. Because after a little while, either they will exist, and I've got lots of ideas in my notebooks over the years that I generated the idea, and then 5 years later, 10 years later, 2 years later, it's a significant product. That means I missed an opportunity, but it also gives me feedback that my ideas were good and I just didn't follow them up. And then there's other ideas that are just junk. So you got to go through them. So expanding involves acquiring new skills and sharing your knowledge to solve problems. And this goes two ways. So you can expand by acquiring new skills yourself or acquiring new skills within your team, because I view entrepreneurship and innovation as a team sport. But always acquiring new skills is a good way for you to go farther down. Interestingly, Lotspot, which I already mentioned, right? They started out as a team, and one of the students who was mostly he was a business major who took the technology cross-disciplinary core, right, is now one of their main technical developers. Along the way, he started gaining skills in software development, and as the company needed more and more of those skills, he was able to really expand and see opportunities to advance the company and himself by gaining those skills. So always a good way to sort of build your opportunity recognition. Exposing is focusing on opening yourselves to circumstances and events. Brainstorming can be a useful tool to build exposure, but I actually find the first part is opening yourself to circumstances and events. When I was young, I was not very outgoing. I grew up on a farm and didn't have a lot of interaction with as many other people. And I was relatively introverted, but I knew I wanted to be a professor. So I continued to work on putting myself in circumstances and events that would get me more and more comfortable with it. And today, modulo COVID, so before COVID, right, I would probably go to at least 2 networking events a month and sometimes as many as 8, right? 1 or 2 a week in the peak seasons, right? And I'm out there always trying to find connections and do things. And some of those have turned into connections where I help their business. Some of them have helped the university. Some of them have been mutually going after joint things. So focusing on opportunities is often about focusing on what other people's problems and needs are. And you can only do that if you interact with other people's needs. And helping them solve their problem may give you ideas for your own business. But if nothing else, it also builds a network that can help you when you start to recognize opportunities to help refine them or to move forward on solving them. Finally, as part of this, the SEEK model is challenging. Overcoming past failures by braving new encounters, focusing on new efforts and trying new things. And so this is again something, it's not the fear of failure that stops people. It's often the fear of fear that stops people. And they relate to the fear of failure, but very often they haven't actually computed what's the risk of failure. In fact, so figuring out how to overcome past failures by braving new encounters. So Again, failure is in some parts of the entrepreneurial community embraced, something we should fail faster. I'm really not interested at all in failing, and I'm not really interested in you learning to accept failure. I'm interested in you learning to accept learning from negative outcomes. The true failure is when you fail to learn. If you do the same thing and it hits you a second time, that's a real failure. If something doesn't work out the way you want, well, that's just a negative outcome and you learn from it and move on. So you got to learn how to overcome those past negative experiences by braving new encounters. Lots of people like to think of entrepreneurs as risk-taking, and we've already had a little bit of this mentioned earlier, but in reality, most entrepreneurs are not greater at accepting risk. They are greater at having learned from past mistakes. They're better at analyzing risk so that they don't have failures. Because you can't really fail and lose millions of dollars multiple times. You can only do it once or twice and survive. But if you're better at analyzing risks than other people, then you can go out and think, okay, I've got this. One of the things you've probably seen is my shark background, right? A photo I took. I've been shark diving for, 20 some years now, but I started doing this because I was afraid of things. And learning to overcome your fears is often done by analyzing the actual risks and then understanding what those risks are and accepting that in your mind you can understand those risks. So the first place I went shark diving was in the Bahamas, where the same shop runs a shark dive and a dolphin dive. And in fact, when I first went there, they'd been operating for 15 years already, 20 years maybe. They had never ever had anyone bitten by a shark, but they had 2 to 3 dolphin bites a year. And yet almost no one was scared to go on the dolphin dive, and lots of people were petrified of the shark dive. Analyzing the risks, it became very clear that this is just an irrational fear, often fed by the media, but that sharks are the more deadly, more likely to bite us. We're not on the shark's food chain. They're not really more likely to bite us. More people die of dog bites or bee stings every year than shark bites. And more people are bitten by dolphins than by sharks. But they don't make the news because most of the dolphin bites are viewed as painful. What would happen is people would literally try and pat the dolphin on the head, but the echolocation chamber that's at the top of their head, dolphins don't like being petted. So when you go to do that, they'll often bite you. People respect the shark, they stay away, and very rarely are people bitten. So figuring out what the real risks are and what are the past failures, past negative outcomes, and braving new things can be in a very important way of moving forward. Focusing on new efforts and trying things. So in the book, they have this little matrix of the degree of novelty and the value and usefulness. The most important things are those things that have high degree of novelty and high usefulness. Those tend to be true innovations, true ideas that lead to an impact. Where things that have high degree of novelty but very low usefulness, the book calls invention, which to me is not at all true. Invention happens in all 4 quadrants. But something that's highly novel and low value is a useless invention. And I'll make that slight caveat because there are inventions that can be low novelty or high novelty and high value. Inventions that are useless may or may not even start out that way. There are multiple technologies that, as a patent, and by the way, like more than 95% of all patents don't ever generate much value. But there are patents that started off and appeared useless, and then 2 or 3 years after they were issued, all of a sudden they became the beginnings of a significant industry. Because it sometimes takes a combination of multiple things. So I told you the invention related to remote reality. The one thing I didn't tell you is, and I hinted a little bit at part of the problem was, we were in fact too early. At the time, the invention for real estate was just unsellable. You just couldn't, people didn't have enough bandwidth to do this. People were not shopping for houses online at the time. It was an idea ahead of its time. Again, a cliche you've probably heard. That doesn't mean it has low value forever. It just currently has low value. So sometimes you have to move things in this space between them. Improvements are generally low degree of novelty and high value. So this is quite common. Lots of companies make improvements, and that can be a good space to be in. And things that are in the low novelty, low usefulness are truly irrelevant, right? And believe me, there are plenty of ideas that are irrelevant. Value and usefulness, you have to be a little careful, because what is valuable and useful to you may or may not be a good measure of value and usefulness to all of society. You may or may not appreciate art or sports or technological gadgets, but some segment of the population appreciates all difference of those 3 in different ways. So it may be slightly different in how they go. So the book talks a little bit about the myth of the isolated inventor. Ideas really do rarely come out of thin air. Mostly they come because of either identifying a problem and then working to solve it, or taking existing ideas and expanding them in some useful way. Okay. So in this course, for our the book talks about innovation as something that makes existing inventions useful or valuable. To me, that is not what innovation is. That's an aspect or one potential dimension of innovation. We define in the BI innovation as the transformation of ideas into impact. And you can relate that back to the book because impact could be more useful or more valuable. But it doesn't have to be taking an existing invention, right? It can be a new one, it can be a whole bunch of things. So I like to focus on the impact, which makes it easier to view it in terms of societal impact, social impact, environmental impact, whatever dimensions you want to talk about it. So the book goes through 7 strategies for idea generation, analytic strategies, search strategies, imagination-based strategies, habit-breaking strategies, relationship-seeking strategies, development strategies, and interpersonal strategies. We actually, in ENTP1000, there's a lot more where you talk about this. We will talk a little bit about brainstorming and idea generation, but my experience in this class and entrepreneurship in general is people don't have a problem with ideas. What they have a problem with is figuring out which ideas are worth pursuing, and we'll spend a little bit more time on that throughout the semester. Finally, and I want to bring it back to, the book sort of doesn't get into this, but in my view, innovation and entrepreneurship, and especially entrepreneurship, is not about ideas. People often fall in love with their ideas, they get sucked into their ideas. The real problem for most entrepreneurship is execution. And in fact, in my view of the process of discovering opportunities, sort of blueprinting and finalizing the ideas, testing and assessing ideas, right? That loop, because that goes back down to then discovering new opportunities, right? That loop, it's the execution of analyzing ideas that is the really important part of opportunity discovery. It isn't having an idea. Those are really easy to have. Many of them are not useful. Most of them are not useful. It's figuring out how to evaluate them and testing them. That's the important part. And so throughout the rest of the semester, we'll be spending time on how do we go to the next stages and looking at evaluating and assessing ideas. So that's it from chapter 5. Again, this is not all the material in chapter 5. Your quiz will cover that. The midterm will have material from sections that I thought the book did a good job on. I try and cover the material that I thought I either wanted to emphasize a little bit more or say something slightly different from the book. So thank you.